Clint Eastwood was mid-sentence when he stopped. Not at the end of a thought, in the middle of a word. His head turned toward the third row slowly, the way a person turns when they hear something that cannot be accounted for. He sat that way for 3 full seconds. Then he stood from his chair, crossed the stage without speaking, and stepped off the front edge into the audience. Jimmy Fallon didn't move. The band didn't play. 300 people in that studio watched one of the most self-contained men in the history of American cinema walk off a stage in complete silence after hearing a voice come from the third row. Nobody, not the producers, not the floor crew, not Jimmy Fallon himself, had any explanation for what was happening. It was a Thursday evening in October 2023. The Tonight Show had scheduled Clint Eastwood for what was billed as a career retrospective, a wide-ranging conversation spanning more than 6 decades of film. The audience that night skewed older than most late-night crowds, mostly men and women in their 60s and 70s, many of them there not just for the films, but for something harder to name. The quality of a person who has been a fixture in American culture for so long that their absence would leave a specific kind of silence in the room. Eastwood came out in a dark jacket, moving at his own pace, and sat across from Jimmy with the ease of someone who has never found interviews particularly threatening. The conversation had ranged across his entire career. The Italian westerns, the directing work, what he still thought about at 93 when he sat down to compose music in the early morning. Everything was measured. Everything was controlled. The Tonight Show's segment producer later said she had never seen a guest hold a room so completely through pure containment alone in 21 years of live television. The control room still talks about what happened 40 minutes into the interview. Jimmy had asked about the years before any of it. The Rawhide period, the San Fernando Valley, the Sunday evenings when Eastwood had played piano at small jazz clubs while nobody knew his name. Eastwood smiled slightly at the question and began to answer. Something about the way music had always been the thing he reached for when the work of acting felt uncertain, when he needed somewhere to go that wasn't a set. And then a sound came from the third row, not a voice calling out, not an alert, a recording. A woman's voice, young, unaccompanied, just a voice in a quiet room, singing a melody that was slow and unresolved. The kind of melody that sounds like it belongs to someone rather than being performed for an audience. Not theatrical, not polished, just a voice. Old, thin, real, Eastwood heard it, and his eyes moved to the third row, the way eyes move towards something recognized before the mind has finished processing. He stopped speaking. He sat very still and listened. His face moved through something, not grief, not surprise, something earlier than either of those. The confusion that comes first, and then, 3 seconds later, the recognition. Then, he stood up. The entire studio froze. He hadn't been cued to move. The interview wasn't over. Nothing had been signaled. The questions moved through the room in silence. Was he unwell? Was something wrong with his health? He was 93 years old, and he was standing and crossing the stage without looking at Jimmy Fallon, without looking at the cameras, without a word of explanation. He stepped off the front edge of the stage and moved into the center aisle. Then, he stopped. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but caught perfectly by his lapel microphone. Ruth, just the name. Nothing else. 300 people held their breath. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1960. Clint Eastwood wasn't always Clint Eastwood, icon and legend. In the summer of 1960, a 30-year-old Clint Eastwood was filming the second season of Rawhide in California. He was not yet famous. He was a working actor on a television western, living modestly in the San Fernando Valley, and what he did on Sunday evenings was play piano at a small jazz club in Van Nuys. Not because anyone asked him to, not because it paid anything, but because music was the thing he returned to when everything else felt uncertain. He had played piano since his teens. He was not a professional, but he was serious about it in the way that people are serious about things they will never be paid for, the way those things become more important because of it. The club was called the Blue Door. It held maybe 80 people on a full night. It usually seated 40. Ruth Callahan was 23 years old. She was a music student at a small college in the San Fernando Valley and performed at the Blue Door on Sunday evenings as a vocalist, not as a professional, not with any intention of becoming one, but simply because she had grown up singing and the club needed someone who could carry a room. She came alone because none of her friends could sit still for jazz. On a Sunday evening in August, she arrived to find a man she had never seen before already at the piano, tall, quiet, occupying the room without announcing himself. She introduced herself. He said his name was Clint. He was working on a television show. She probably hadn't seen it. She said she hadn't. They played together that evening for a set that ran close to an hour. Something in her voice pulled a melody from him that he had never played before. Not something he had been developing or reaching for. Something that arrived in the moment she began to sing, the way certain things only arrive when the conditions are exactly right and not a moment earlier. After the set, he sat at the piano for a while, working out the chord progression on paper. He wrote it down on a cocktail napkin. He tore it in half. He slid one half across the piano to her and kept the other. She kept her half inside the front cover of her music theory textbook for 64 years. She left Los Angeles after graduating and settled eventually in Carmel, California, the same town where Eastwood would build his life, buy a ranch, open a restaurant, and later serve as mayor. She became a music teacher. She taught elementary school music for 32 years. She raised 2 children. She attended every Eastwood film on opening weekend, without exception, for more than 60 years. In Carmel, she saw him occasionally over the decades, at the market, at community events, the proximity that small towns create without necessarily creating contact. She never introduced herself. The summer of 1960 was the whole of what they had shared, and she wanted to keep it exactly that size. She didn't want to become a story. She wanted to stay a memory. The morning after the evening at the Blue Door, she had gone home and recorded herself singing the melody they had played together. She had a small reel-to-reel recorder she used for college coursework. She pressed record, sang through the melody once from memory, and pressed stop. The recording was 3 minutes and 12 seconds long. In September 2023, Ruth Harlan McCallahan was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Doctors gave her 3 to 4 months. Her daughter found the original reel in a shoebox on a closet shelf, alongside half of a cocktail napkin in a cellophane sleeve, alongside a music theory textbook with a pencil line marking the inside of the front cover. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time before composing a letter to Clint Eastwood's management team. The response came the following morning. The arrangement was made in complete secrecy. The Tonight Show staff were told only that a specific guest required a seat in the 3rd row and was not to be approached or photographed before the show began. No one on the production team was told who she was. No one was told about the recording or the napkin. Eastwood had said, very simply, to the one person on his team who knew, "I want her to feel like a person, not a moment." Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Behind the scenes, Clint Eastwood had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He told no one on the Tonight Show staff about the third row. He had listened to the recording alone that afternoon and had not spoken for a long time afterward. Ruth believed she had simply received a ticket. She did not know Eastwood had already found her face on the side stage monitor the moment the doors opened. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Eastwood had been talking about the early years, the television work, the San Fernando Valley, the Sunday evenings at the piano, when the recording began playing from the third row. It was 3 minutes and 12 seconds of a young woman's voice, unaccompanied, singing a melody in a quiet room 4 years ago. He recognized it in less than 4 seconds. Not from having heard it played back, he never had. From carrying the chord progression in his memory for 64 years, the way you carry something you wrote on a napkin and tore in half and never once forgot. He had the other half of that napkin in the inside pocket of his jacket. He had transferred it from his wallet to his breast pocket before walking out. He moved through the center aisle without rushing. People stepped aside without being asked. The recording was still playing softly from the speaker in Ruth's daughter's hand. Jimmy Fallon came over his desk. He didn't think about it, and he didn't announce it. He simply climbed over his desk, walked to the edge of the stage, and stood there. He looked at Eastwood, then at the third row, then back at the audience. He said, "Very quietly, folks, I think we need to let this happen." And then nothing else. Ruth Harlan was in the third row. She was 77 years old, and she was thin, and the flight from Monterey had taken more out of her than she had told her daughter. She was wearing a gray wool jacket. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was watching Eastwood move toward her through the rows with the expression of a person who has been waiting a long time for a moment and is not yet entirely certain it is real. Eastwood reached the third row and crouched down so he was below her eye level. He took both of her hands in his without speaking. The recording was still running softly from the speaker. He waited for it to end. When it stopped, the room was completely quiet. "You recorded that the next morning," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ruth looked at him. "I went home and I didn't want to forget it." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and drew out a piece of paper, old, soft at the folds, handled many times across many years. He unfolded it carefully and held it between them. Half a cocktail napkin. A chord progression in pencil, 64 years old. Ruth's daughter reached into her bag and took out a small envelope. She drew out the other half of the napkin and placed it on the arm of the seat beside Ruth. Eastwood picked it up. He held both halves together, edge to edge, and looked at the line where they met, the pencil markings running from one piece to the other. "That melody became something," he said. "I used it, I know." Ruth's voice quiet and steady. "I recognized it in the theater the first time I heard it. You never said anything. It wasn't mine to say." A pause. "The music was yours." He held the two halves of the napkin together for a long time. Then, he placed them both, joined, in her hands. The standing ovation began somewhere in the middle of the room and moved outward like a wave until 300 people were on their feet, and the sound in that studio was something considerably larger than applause. Questlove stood from behind his drum kit and did not sit back down. The director did not cut to commercial. The cameraman closest to the third row held his shot on Eastwood and Ruth and did not move it. Jimmy Fallon stood at the edge of the stage with one hand pressed flat over his mouth. He did not say a word. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Ruth Harlan returned to Carmel the morning after the taping. Eastwood called her every week for the next 12 weeks. Her daughter had both halves of the napkin framed together, the full chord progression, reunited, and they hang now on the wall above Ruth's upright piano in the room, where she taught music for 32 years. Ruth died on a Monday morning in February. She was 77 years old. Her daughter wrote the obituary. It said that Ruth Harlan had taught music in Carmel for 3 decades and had never once told her students that the man who lived on the other side of town had written half a melody for her voice in the summer of 1960. Clint Eastwood attended the service. He sat in the 3rd row. He did not speak publicly. He arrived alone and left alone and stayed until the room was empty. On the drive back to his ranch, he told his assistant he wanted to finish the chord progression, the part that came after the torn edge, the part he had never written down because he had never found the right moment to end it. He said he thought he finally knew how it went. Some melodies take 60 years to resolve.